Hello everyone, Thersites the Historian here. Yesterday I thought about doing a special April Fool's episode where instead of trying to play a prank, I instead dealt with a fool. And my subject was going to be this very article we're looking at right now. Of course, I did not get around to doing that yesterday, so we're doing it today. Maybe we can call this spring cleaning, I'm not sure. But as we go along on this channel, I would like to locate more very bad uses and interpretations of history, especially ones which are put forward to the general public that might deceive them. So if you find anything similar to this article, please send it to me or draw my attention to it in some way, and hopefully I will get around to addressing it at some point. This article comes to us from the Washington Times, and it is entitled, "Progressives, Beware of Julius Caesar's Fate." Caesar relied on an aggressive squeeze-the-rich strategy that failed spectacularly. So the first line almost seems like a threat. The idea being, progressives, if you act like Julius Caesar, you too will die at the feet of a statue of Pompey. That's not actually how this article goes once it gets started, but this title definitely seems to imply that. Also, if you're going to invoke Julius Caesar, you should know that he was murdered by 23 daggers, not a sword, as is depicted in this picture. And there's a famous reference to the Caesar assassination, the Ides of March, meaning March 15th. Why not progressives beware the Ides of March? And then it comes across as a little weird, a little catchy, because it's not something that you would expect to see. And then you have to scroll down to see what it is. It's called a hook. That's part of journalism. But hey, far be it from me to tell these people how to do their job. The two authors here are Steve H. Hankey and Joshua Bluestein. Both of them work at the Cato Institute, and one of them is apparently a professor of applied economics, although I really don't know why this person could not apply his economic power to go to Barnes & Noble and buy a book on Roman history. Nonetheless, I guess there's a difference between theory and practice, so that might explain it. Analysis/opinion. Okay, so at least they're not saying this is factual. And what we'll see here is that this operates on two levels. On the one level, they misrepresent what progressives are and what they stand for. On the other level, they vastly misrepresent Roman politics. When it comes to the politics of the Roman Republic, I can almost understand where they're coming from, in the sense that these guys don't study it, so maybe they have a skewed understanding which is still based in good faith. Maybe they honestly believe this just out of pure ignorance. But given how desperate they are to make progressives and Caesar the same thing, I have to think that they are deliberately distorting the facts, at least to some extent. Some of this is probably due to ignorance, however. As we consider the manifestos of today's progressives, we should ask, what can we learn from the reign of Julius Caesar? That's a great opening line, because I know every time I think about Medicare for All or a Green New Deal, I think Julius Caesar would be proud, because he would completely understand this issue. It was so relevant in his time. Julius Caesar established the Roman Empire. No, he did not. Julius Caesar operated under the Roman Republic, and it was only his great-grandnephew, Octavian, or maybe just grandnephew, who became the Emperor Augustus. So that will not happen until after Caesar is dead, and had Caesar lived, he had no intention of founding a monarchy, at least not so far as I can tell. He just wanted to be first in the Republic, and he wanted to go on to conquer Parthia, and then I presume, given his health, he probably assumed that he would die. So there was no grand plan. Octavian took Caesar's estate in his name and worked from there to build the empire after having to overcome Lepidus, Antony, and the assassins. So anyway, Caesar did not establish the empire, but do proceed, and crowned himself Dictator Perpetuo, dictator for life. That is true, and the reason is because he thought this was his best protection from prosecution. Although, as a dictator, he was planning on very much loosening things up over the next few years that he was in Parthia. There's a very good chance, for instance, that in the year 41, the Romans would have elected Brutus and Cassius as the two consuls, and Caesar would not have stopped them because he had reconciled with them. He thought that they were his friends now, or at least they were okay with him, even if they weren't quite down with his politics. And actually, he was good friends with both Brutii, Decimus and Marcus. So he was especially shocked when Decimus turned on him. Just how did he become so powerful? Caesar promised the Romans everything under the sun, everything that they would not have to pay for. And here the bullshit really gets flowing. Caesar became powerful because he was born very wealthy, just like all of his colleagues, and he was very politically adroit. He knew how to message, he knew how to make alliances, he knew how to get money out of people like Crassus, he knew how to exploit the popularity of his friend Pompey, and he managed to insert himself into a group with the two of them. And the reason that opportunity emerged is not because Caesar was going around advertising free stuff. It was because Pompey had lots and lots of veterans who needed to be settled after a lengthy campaign. Since the time of Marius, it had become standard for Rome to make sure that veteran legionaries were settled. They were given a settlement of cash or land or some combination of both. To not settle them would have led to a great deal of unrest in Rome. This would have been very, very bad. You don't want armed men with skill in war wandering around your streets, homeless, poor, and bored. That is the last thing you want. You want to give them a farm somewhere to make sure that they feel like their services were rewarded by the Republic. So Pompey was getting shut down by the Senate because they didn't want him to get credit with all of those men, even though those men were already loyal to Pompey, so it was pretty pointless to begin with. And then Pompey had to turn to his old rival Crassus, and the guy who united the two of them to form a power block was Caesar, the guy who was politically astute but a lot less powerful. So that's how the first triumvirate came to be. That was the basis of Caesar's power. He then used that as a springboard to get the command in Gaul and build an army of 10 or so legions while conquering pretty much all of what is modern-day France. So that's how he became so powerful. And maybe he gave out a few things here and there, but all Roman politicians did use the dole or relied to some extent upon great public entertainment. So that is not unusual, and it's not something he invented. If this story rings a bell, it doesn't. It's because Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, and today's progressives are doing the same thing. I never knew that Bernie went into Gaul, killed 1/3 of the people, enslaved another third, and left the other third there to serve as citizens. That's news to me. They're proposing Medicare for all, the Green New Deal, free college, student debt cancellation, and an ever-expanding laundry list of free programs. No one on the progressive side has said that these things are free. This is a straw man argument that the right uses over and over and over. What progressives do say is that if we're going to be paying out the ass in taxes, which we already are, we should get something back for those things. We should get the same amenities that other countries enjoy. Right now, we pay about the same amount of taxes if you add up our local, state, and federal government, and we get far less for it. We're not getting a very good deal, you might say. No one is stupid enough to think that these things are free. No one. We should all ponder what Cato the Younger and Cicero pondered. How is all of this going to be paid for? That was not what they were wondering. They knew how it would be paid for, mostly by war booty. So they didn't have a problem with that. Rome was built on conquest. And they knew also that if land was going to be confiscated, it was going to come from non-Roman citizens, i.e. not from themselves, most likely. It might come from the ager publicus, which many senators had appropriated illegally, so they were worried about that, but they were not necessarily worried about their own bank accounts being raided. So basically, what this article is trying to do is to make the argument that successful businessmen today are victims of the progressive agenda and that senators were the victims of Caesar's agenda. In both cases, it's completely asinine, but also very different situations to begin with. And the main concern that Cato and Cicero had, as I alluded to above, is that if you allow someone like Pompey or Caesar to settle a bunch of veterans and to really accomplish a lot, then their personal prestige becomes greater than that of their colleagues in the Senate. The Senate was an oligarchy based around the equality of about 600 or so men. And by equality, I mean that in the loose sense. Obviously, not all of them were completely equal, but they were approximately on the same level of wealth, power, and influence. And as long as somebody didn't get too far ahead of the rest, they could be kind of held in. The problem, of course, is once you get professional legions, they look to their generals, who led them in battle, to do the settlement. So now, men in the legions are loyal not to the Senate as a whole, especially if the Senate as a whole plays politics when it's time to pay them. They look to the generals, because they know the generals have a bond with them, and that general's legacy is caught up in the feats of arms that they accomplished together. So they're thinking, and there's some differences between Cato and Cicero, by the way. They're not on the same page. Cicero found Cato to be deeply annoying and idealistic. Their thinking was, we need to hold back these great individuals for the good of the general oligarchy. As it turned out in Caesar's case, he relied upon an aggressive squeeze-the-rich strategy. Does this sound familiar? The thing is, in America today, there are people who talk about squeezing the rich, and it never happens. So, no one really knows at this point what the impact would be if we actually did it today, because this is not something that most of us have ever seen in our lifetimes. So, there's that, but also, Caesar did not do this. Caesar was more what you might call populist than his opponents, and he might be more willing to dole out grain or put on great entertainments. But most of his supporters, even the guys who are not big-name supporters, guys who are not patricians like himself, were still wealthy men who came from the equestrian order and had political ambitions. They were all men whose position was very much built upon their wealth, and their continued holding of that position was also predicated upon their wealth staying the same or increasing. There was no war on wealth under Julius Caesar. This is simply fiction. Total bullshit. Take a drink here. Julius Caesar was Rome's greatest popularis, a man of the people. He's probably the most famous adherent of the school, or not the school, but the outlook, I guess you could call it. I mean, with Rome, there aren't clear parties. That's why scholars use words such as retinue, which usually describes the group around them in the more literal sense of the poor people they use as guards and whatever. But they also use the terms cliques, factions. Roman allegiances shifted pretty rapidly, and they were not overly ideological. But of course, here we're going to get a portrait of the populares and optimates as if they were the Republicans and Democrats, these two institutional forces which continue generation after generation, and while they do change, they pretend that they don't. The Republicans still say they're the party of Lincoln, and the Democrats, when elections are being held, still say that they're the party of FDR, even though they barely uphold any of the parts of the New Deal at this point. Appian of Alexandria described Caesar as wanting to introduce laws to better the condition of the poor. Well, that's true. And again, there are reasons for that. Caesar knew that if you have a bunch of poor people in Rome, which is a small area full of 1 million or so people, and these people are desperate, then you will have problems that you cannot contain. Also, Rome had conquered a bunch of land under himself and his colleague Pompey. There were plenty of places for Romans to settle. There's no reason for everyone to be globbed together in Rome, living in squalor. You can spread people out, give them farms. They can live more productive lives. They can live wealthier lives. And they can spread Roman power. That was mostly what Caesar was trying to do. So this was something which both helped the poor and helped to spread the power of Rome over all of its new conquest. With the goal of the gradual equalization of the classes through a broad program of redistribution. I'm 99% sure Appian does not say that. I'm not going to bother looking it up because they don't have a quote here or a citation, and I imagine that they're just kind of going off of the first part and spitballing a bit. But I'm pretty sure Appian never says anything of that nature. The only people who typically get accused of something of this nature, of having a broad program of redistribution, are the Gracchi brothers, and in that case it's also not true, really, because what they were doing was redistributing the ager publicus, the public land, which was supposed to be for distribution to Romans, but which Roman elites were camped out on, and they had expanded their farms onto it without permission, and then they were pissed off that it was being taken away, even though it was not theirs to begin with. And of course, after the Gracchi died, the land was then formally sold off and ended up in the hands of the elite. But, anyway. He engaged in a legislative frenzy, pushing many bills and laws. A lot of the bills that he pushed were not about class struggle, though. One of the bills he pushed was reforming the calendar to make it more regular. The Julian calendar has only been amended very slightly by the Gregorian calendar. So he basically created the modern calendar, and he ended the need to add intercalary months to the year to make sure that the seasons matched up with the weather. He penned a land reform bill with the goal of, as Plutarch explained, dividing land among the poor and needy. As I already explained, this was mostly an effort to set up colonies, which, by the way, was something that the Romans had been doing since the very early Republic. This is how they conquered Italy itself, was establishing colonies. He spent exorbitant sums on public works to help ease unemployment. Sort of. The public works were largely about creating urban amenities and about memorializing the names of the people who built them. So Caesar and his supporters, or in the case of his opponents, who also built public works, by the way, it was the same thing, just for a different group of people. The idea is that you memorialize your name by putting it in writing on a building that people will come to love. You can build public baths, you can build stadiums, theaters, you can put up all kinds of different things that people will enjoy. Water fountains, statues, you name it. Temples. A lot of victorious generals would come home and dedicate a temple somewhere in Rome. This was also seen as a public good as it brought more favor from the gods onto the Romans. So, a lot of these things were not designed to create jobs. That was just sort of an inadvertent effect. The Romans had no theory of economics as we understand it. Progressives today do see public works as a way to create a jobs program. And this was very much part of relieving the Great Depression using the policies of John Maynard Keynes. If you have a bunch of people working and doing things that benefit the public in the long run, and they're getting paid and spending money in the short run, this boosts your economy. We understand that now, but the Romans did not. Again, there was no theory of economics. The word economics back then, for the Greeks, who were much more theory-based than the Romans, meant household management. So, economics would mean that you're good at balancing your checkbook. It would not mean that you have an overarching understanding of economic activities in your entire nation or around the world. That also annoys me in general when modern historians try to foist modern economic principles onto the deep past. If the people back then didn't understand what these things were, then they could not have acted in accordance with them. There's also a video by Tick, or T-I-K, the guy who does World War II videos, who says that by the rules of Austrian economics, the Soviet Union should have collapsed in 1942 or 43. They didn't know about that. Austrian economics wasn't a thing yet. There was no government ministry keeping track of economic numbers, and there was no person in the office who was versed in economics which hadn't been invented yet who could go to Stalin and say, dude, we're fucked. Okay? This is just not a valid way to address the past. Aside from supply and demand, which is self-evident, most of the more abstract concepts of economics do not apply especially to the pre-modern world. He remitted a whole year of rent for poor tenants and ordered, in effect, as Suetonius reckons, the cancellation of 1/4 of all outstanding debt. Debt cancellation, by the way, was a fairly common practice in antiquity. The Greek city-states also did this. And the reason is because a lot of times things would get out of hand, where you would have the creditors holding all the wealth in the polis, and there was really no activity because too many people were too deeply in debt. Without enough people being free to act and spend money and do things, people figured out this is a negative for the whole public. So they would do a debt cancellation. Another reason, of course, as I mentioned earlier, you do not want mass-scale unrest with the bulk of the people in a confined space being unhappy. So, one way to alleviate the pressure is to do a debt relief. And then, once you do a debt relief, you usually see within 10 to 20 years, because there was no attempt to address the underlying causes of what caused people to get into debt, you end up right back in the same spot. So, debt relief sort of came in cycles, usually. And Caesar was not the first or last person to have to do this. He instituted rent controls and gave handouts of 100 denarii to each plebe. Rent controls are important because, again, a lot of people in the urban area of Rome were living in deep poverty, and they only had seasonal work if they were lucky. As for the handouts of 100 denarii, this was, again, a way to try to stave off social unrest. The Roman public had been at war for about 4 years, and in a civil war, this meant that the grain supply, which came from Africa and was subsidized, which meant that it was affordable for most people, had not been coming reliably. So the Roman people, who had nothing to do with the civil war between Pompey and Caesar, had suffered, and Caesar wanted to try to make it up to them in some small measure. This was kind of like giving a check during the pandemic. It's much more in alignment with that than just giving a random gift of money. Furthermore, public entertainment was frequent, and it was free. It wasn't as frequent as some people think, and also because of the size of the population in Rome, not everyone would get to attend. So you might get to go to some of the events in a year, but you wouldn't get to go to all of them. And not to mention, a lot of people did have to work, so when it was your time to work in the year, if you're a construction guy, you might have to go help repair a temple, and you won't be able to go see the gladiatorial show in the Forum, for instance. After crossing the Rubicon and enduring years of war, the people deserved, according to Caesar, to be rewarded for their resilience. Yeah, and as I mentioned earlier, I think that's correct. For example, in 46 BC, Caesar hosted enormous festivals, parades, and gladiatorial games, often lasting weeks. Showered with all these freebies, the public adored Caesar. It's a little bit of a simplification there. Partly the public adored Caesar because he gave more of a shit about them than the Senate did, or the main bulk of the Senate, I should say. Caesar actually had a pretty considerable chunk of the Senate on his side. The more elite crowd, however, did not want to give the public anything, and they just wanted to ignore their suffering. And the reason they didn't want to give anything is, again, primarily because they thought the person or people who gave something would become too beloved, and they didn't want that. So, if they had devised a way for the Senate as a whole to give a gift, you might have seen attitudes shift quite a bit among many of the people who identified as optimates. Cicero, I think, would have gone for that. Cato, maybe not. How did this free-for-all strategy work out? Led by Cato, opposition to Caesar's policies was fierce in the Roman Senate from the very beginning. Yes, and. Is just meeting with resistance a reason why something is bad or wrong? Is Cato the arbiter of what is wise public policy? Cato was an unsuccessful politician. He's got one of the most noble names in all of Rome, and his intransigence helped to drive Pompey to create the first triumvirate. If Pompey would have been able to settle his veterans, as every other general was, then he would not have needed to align himself with Crassus and Caesar to form the supergroup, the first triumvirate. Cato was partly responsible for that. He was one of the main guys pushing Pompey to the brink of desperation. Pompey understood that if his veterans weren't settled, not only would it look bad upon him, but it would also leave lots of landless, poor men with weapons roaming about Rome. So, yeah, it was something that he had to do. He was pretty much forced to do the triumvirate because of Cato being a hard ass. The Senate managed to kill Caesar's land bill, with Cicero calling the proposed law a plot against liberty, warning that Caesar's rhetoric would lead to an onslaught on private property, cancellation of debts, and plundering the well-to-do. Cicero was notorious for exaggerating everything. Cicero is the kind of guy who, when he would speak out against someone, he would then appear in public wearing a breastplate and beg the public to protect him against assassination. And he was very much the errand boy of the Optimates during Caesar's consulship in 59. He was their chief and best speaker. So of course he's trying to rally all of the elite against Caesar's policies. And now here comes a much bigger piece of bullshit. Even some members of the public began to question the viability of Caesar's giveaway schemes. The evidence is that most Romans were not terribly concerned with who was in power at any given time, for the most part, and Caesar did enjoy a great deal of popularity. Caesar was usually cheered in public. His opponents were often jeered. Caesar usually won his elections pretty easily. A lot of his opponents did not. Cato was not able to win election to the consulship, despite running a couple different times. Caesar won handily. You understand how this works. There weren't that many people who had serious concerns outside of the Senate. Most Romans either didn't give a shit, or they thought that Caesar was preferable to the Optimates. To quell the Roman public's concerns, Caesar proclaimed, "Let none of you suspect that I shall harass any man who is rich or establish new taxes. I shall be satisfied with the present revenues." So basically what they're trying to do here is do a callback to the George H.W. Bush promise, read my lips, no new taxes, and then he, of course, had to raise some taxes. Caesar was lying. Was he, though? Let's see. He confiscated the wealth of overseas dependencies and fleeced the lands he conquered. That's not the same thing. The Romans were fine with fleecing conquered lands. That was the standard practice. This was not just something that Caesar did. Every Roman, from the time that they began to expand outside of Italy, used the provinces as a personal ATM and then gave kickbacks to friends and allies back in Rome. This is part of why senators kept getting richer and richer and elections kept getting more and more expensive. And also, when Augustus reformed how provinces were governed, part of it is to prevent governors from becoming extremely wealthy and then challenging him. But also, it was to lower unrest, because the provincials, believe it or not, did not enjoy having the shit taxed out of them and being rounded up and having their stuff hauled out of their houses. And also, now we're crossing into the realm of imperialism more so than what you might call domestic politics. Taxation is in the realm of domestic politics. What we're talking about now is really more imperialism. But in need of ever more cash to fuel his largesse, Caesar decided to squeeze the wealthy and force the rich to empty their pockets into the public treasury. No, he did not. There was no large-scale squeeze-the-rich scheme. He increased duties on luxury imports, introduced Rome's first sales tax, and enforced strict sumptuary laws. Okay, the sumptuary laws are not about taxing rich people. Those are about limiting displays of luxury. There are a couple reasons why he did this. One, it was tradition. The Romans were not supposed to be a people of great luxury, but this had fallen by the wayside in the last 50 or so years. Another reason is that, again, as we mentioned earlier, people were suffering after a few years of civil war, so to see some douchebag senator parading his wealth around the forum was not something that was designed to make the public happy or content. So Caesar forced people to stop doing that kind of shit. As far as a few luxury import taxes, those are not backbreaking by any stretch of the imagination. Many of the senators who complained had multiple large estates, plantations. Imagine owning 2 or 3 plantations with 100 or more slaves apiece, and then bitching because you have to pay a little bit more money for silk or for wine from some remote corner of the Republic. It's a ridiculous complaint. In 49 BC, he attempted to enforce a wealth cap at 15,000 silver or gold drachmas. The masses were elated. They went so far as to demand bounties for servants who reported their masters for avoiding Caesar's wealth tax. And a wealth tax it was, 100% on any riches over the cap. Today's down with the rich fever is nothing new. Indeed, it plagued Rome over 2 millennia ago. I find it curious that they do not say which source claims this. I'm unfamiliar with any kind of wealth tax of this nature going on at this time, but also keep in mind that 15,000 gold drachmas is a fuck of a lot of money. Another thing to keep in mind, money back then was physical and literal. There weren't really too many ways to hide money in the abstract. And by abstract, of course, I mean bank accounts where you have a sum of money that you can access digitally. All money was physical, material, coin. So let's say you are over that 15,000 drachma limit. You can just bury it somewhere. That's what people did all the time anyway, even without someone coming for their money. This was a way to keep it away from prying eyes and away from servants who might be itchy-handed. And a lot of times, Romans who buried their money forgot where it was, and we find coin hoards. But I'm very suspicious of the idea that he enforced this very strictly. And if he did in the year 49, then a lot of it is just because he was in the middle of fighting a major civil war. This was not a tax that remained in place, if it was implemented at all. Caesar did capture Pompey's treasury when Pompey was trying to flee Italy, and that helped to fund quite a bit of his subsequent campaigns. Also, Caesar was able to defeat Pompey's armies in Spain before he crossed over to Greece, and he got some money out of that as well. Also, the idea that today has a down with the rich fever, I don't see it so much. I know that there are a lot of people who are opposed to the extreme influence of people like Bill Gates and Jeff Bezos, but in general, I don't think most people are all that angry with the wealthy. I wish they were more angry with the wealthy, but I just don't see it. But Caesar's revenue schemes fell short. Actually, he managed to fund the Civil War and he won. So he got what he wanted. It worked, dude. Consequently, his treasury ran up huge debts and the tide turned. How did the tide turn? He was still popular. He was still in power. He was about to embark upon a Parthian campaign, which clearly required money. Suetonius writes how even the commoners began to disapprove of how things were going, and no longer hid their disgust at Caesar's tyrannical rule, but openly demanded champions to protect their ancient liberties. Out of context. The thing that the commons were disgusted at was the idea that Caesar might take a crown. And Suetonius makes that abundantly clear in his account. The people were not worried about extravagant spending, and they weren't worried about any of the other things that these authors seem to be obsessed with. What they were worried about is that Caesar might end the Republic and implement a monarchy. But again, it does not appear that Caesar planned to do that. It's a bit controversial. I do respect the opinion of people who say that Caesar might have dreamt of a crown, and that maybe the times it was offered to him were sort of testing the waters. That being said, there is no direct evidence that Caesar planned to become a king. By then it was too late. Cassius Dio relates how the populace found much more fault because Caesar had expended countless sums on all that array. Keep in mind the word array. In consequence, a clamor was raised against him. that he had collected most of the funds unjustly. An array, in the archaic English in which many texts are translated and quoted, is an army. What the people were mad about is that many of them were still conscripted in the legions, and that the legions cost a fuck ton of money. They were not worried about excessive spending on festivals, or on gifts, or on grain subsidies. They were cool with those things. They were also cool with founding colonies, especially if they got to go on them. What they were pissed off about is Caesar keeping a bunch of legions under arms that he planned to then take and use for further conquest to glorify himself. So, again, this quote completely disproves itself. How did the great Popularis respond to this protest? He personally grabbed 3 of the rioters, chopped off their heads, and displayed their severed skulls near the Regia. This also seems completely out of context. Caesar once had to deal with a mutiny, and he engaged in such tactics. I'm not aware of him doing this to a mob of people. Once again, I think that there's a context here that is missing. Caesar had to deal with multiple mutinies from some of his legions, including his beloved 10th Legion, and that often did involve putting to death the lead mutineers to restore order. In the end, after Caesar's assassination, Cicero looked at the treasury and bemoaned, "Our knottiest political problem is shortage of money." Yes, civil wars are expensive. They tend to use up money. And when you raise a ton of units and you have a tradition of, we have to settle all the veterans, guess what? You have to spend a lot of money getting them land and money. So all the money that you win in plunder, you have to spend back on the men who got it for you. And during the period of the Civil Wars, there were far, far more than the 28 legions that Augustus would keep as permanent formations. So this would continue to be a problem for years after Cicero was dead. Caesar's spending had left its mark. There is no such thing as a free lunch. What left its mark is when Caesar crossed the Rubicon. What left its mark is when Caesar was murdered rather than allowing a man with epilepsy who was already in his late 50s to die. Had Caesar died of natural causes in the East, the Republic might have had a chance of surviving on. But as it was, he was assassinated, and then there was a public outcry on his behalf. He was losing popularity, but then when he was murdered, all of the old popularity came back to the surface. And then a 19-year-old Octavian and Mark Antony were able to play into the public's dismay at Caesar's demise and rally support to themselves that way. The liberators were then able to rally the support mostly of the elite, and you have yet another round of civil wars which required more new formations to be raised, and then more formations to be retired. So, this is not all on Caesar. Was Caesar part of the problem? Of course. But was he the whole problem? Fuck no. Not even on any level. All of Caesar's free programs were seductive until they weren't. Also, by the way, not only do modern progressives understand that there's no such thing as a free program, but Caesar also understood that. In ancient Rome, as I mentioned, all money was literal and physical. When you purchased something, you had to turn over a pile of metal to get it. And it's included when you spent public funds. The Athenians, for instance, stored their funds in the Temple of Athena, the famous Parthenon. And they would literally have to go up and grab the amount of money they wanted and then spend it to build a ship or whatever they were buying. The treasury was depleted, and the Roman Republic, which had endured 500 years, crumbled as a result. So you get that, guys? The Roman Republic fell because the treasury was empty. That's it. Nothing to do with the Civil War. Nothing to do with a failed political system whereby you had armies which were more loyal to generals than to the Republic as a whole. Nothing to do with rampant political corruption where the senators were far more worried about dick measuring contests with one another than they were with the public welfare. None of that had anything to do with the fall of the Republic. It was just that the treasury was empty. And had the treasury been full, none of those other problems would have mattered in the slightest. So the authors here are Steve H. Hankey, who I assume is the father of the Christmas poo. He's a professor of applied economics at the Johns Hopkins University, and he is the founder and co-director of the Johns Hopkins Institute for Applied Economics, Global Health, and Study of Business Enterprise. All of that sounds great until you realize he's also a senior fellow at the Cato Institute in Washington, D.C., and that explains a lot. The Cato Institute is founded in the name of Cato the Younger, or perhaps Cato the Elder, I'm not entirely sure, maybe both. And the point of it is that no matter what the study is, the conclusion should always be we should lower taxes, cut regulation, and the government sucks. So it is the exact opposite of what scholarship is supposed to be. Scholarship is supposed to approach a problem looking at the evidence and then trying to figure out what is going on from the evidence. The Cato Institute is the exact opposite. It is anti-academic. You start out with the conclusion, then you find evidence which tries to fit that conclusion. And in the case of the Cato Institute here, we see that they don't require their fellows to understand Roman history in the slightest. His partner in crime is Joshua Bluestein. He's a research associate at the Johns Hopkins Institute for Applied Economics, Global Health, and Study of Business Enterprise. So apparently Mr. Bluestein is not tainted by Cato, but he also knows literally nothing about the Roman Republic. So isn't that wonderful? Thank you, Washington Times, for creating a real piece of shit back on Christmas Day of 2019. Until next time, I'm Thersites the Historian, and remember to send me shitty articles which misuse history so that I can go through them and explain precisely why these articles are dog shit. We'll take out the trash together soon. I'll see you around.